Let's write our first program that defines a new method. I'm using Visual Studio Community in this video, and for this project I'm going to choose not to use top-level statements so that we can see how these methods interact with one another. Through the magic of video editing, I'll skip through some of this and get the basics in place. I've got a general solution name and a descriptive project name. I've also renamed my program.cs file, but as I always point out, that's probably not necessary for you. It's just because I'll post this file online. And since I'm not using top-level statements, I have a main method. I've put a comment block at the top, and for the moment, I'll leave the hello world line alone. A method is a block of code that performs an action or a task. The WriteLine method performs the task of displaying text, for example. All the code we've written until now has been in a method called main. Remember that when we work with top-level statements, the main method is made for us by the compiler, so it's still there. We just don't have to deal with it. Main is a special method that runs whenever we start a program, but we can create other methods as well, and they're useful for breaking up our programs as they start to get bigger and more complex. When we define a new method, we have to be really careful about where we put it. Our method has to go inside the class, but we can't put a method inside another method. So we have to put it either above main or below it. Either one is fine because the compiler is going to process this entire file before it runs anything, but I think most C# programmers prefer to keep main at the top, so it's the first thing you see when you start reading through the code. That's different from a language like Python, where you have to define your methods first. So Python programmers are probably in the habit of putting main at the bottom, and that's fine too. I'm going to add a little space after the main method, making sure that I'm still inside the class, and this shows why clean indenting and formatting are helpful. They make it easy to see how these blocks of code are organized. For now, our method definitions are always going to start with the words public and static, and we'll learn what those mean when we start talking about objects and classes. Next, we have to identify what type of data the method is going to return when it's finished running. We'll learn about that as soon as we have the basics of methods down, but at this point I'm going to put void because this method will just run without returning anything. And at last we get to something we've learned about before, an identifier for our method or a name for our method. Since methods perform actions, method names usually have a verb in them. Remember the write method, for example, it writes something to the console, so that's a nice descriptive identifier that's also a verb. And the naming conventions are almost the same as with variable identifiers, except we'll start with an uppercase letter instead of a lowercase, and we'll still use capitals to indicate new words. This naming convention is called Pascal case, in case you're curious. I'm going to call this method output chorus because it's going to print out the chorus of a song. After the identifier, we'll add a set of parentheses. Method names are always followed by parentheses in C#. In fact, anytime you see parentheses in C# code, it's referring to a method. In a little bit, we'll start putting information inside those parentheses, but even when we don't put anything in them, we still need to have the parentheses there. And finally, our method needs a code block, which is a pair of curly braces. This code block defines the body of the method, meaning whatever we put inside these curly braces will be the code that executes when the method is called. We know how this works because main is a method, and we know that whatever we put in the main code block will be what runs when we execute the program. So we can think of a method as a mini program. This method is just going to output the lines of a chorus, which I'll break into a few different WriteLine statements. I'll add in some new line escape sequences here just to remind you how those work. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this program. Well, it compiles and runs, but it's not printing what we expect. This is a really common mistake, and even though I did it on purpose here, I have to admit that I make this kind of a mistake on a pretty regular basis. I've defined the output chorus method, but I haven't done anything to make it execute. I forgot to invoke the method or call the method, which is how I usually say it. So I'm going to go back to the main method and delete this template code, and now I'll call output chorus. Notice that my IDE recognizes that I've defined this method, so it even has that as an autocomplete option. And I just have to remember to put the parentheses and the semicolon to end the line. Now let's try running it again. That looks good. And because it's so fun, let's call that method a couple more times and run it again to see how that looks. Pretty boring, of course, but I'm demonstrating a point. There are going to be a lot of reasons why we use methods, but the most obvious is to let us reuse our code. Once I've made this method, then whenever I want to print out the chorus, I can just call it. You have to kind of imagine that we're doing something really complicated instead of just printing something out. If it's complicated, I don't want to have to type it a bunch of times. I'd rather type it one time in a method and then use that method a bunch of times. Another reason to use methods is that they help make our code easy to maintain. My code has an error. It's missing one line of the lyrics at the end. If I had been just manually typing all those write line statements to make it output the chorus each time, I would now have to go and find this error and fix it in every one of those places. But since it's in a method, I just need to fix it one time. I'll go back to that method and correct my output. And now run it again. And I can see that that one correction fixes the code every time the method is used in my program. Again, you have to imagine our method does something complicated for that to seem like a big deal. We call this quality maintainability, and breaking code up into methods helps with maintainability. Now we can define as many methods as we want. I'll go ahead and make a method to print out the title of the song. Remember that we have to be careful about where we put the method. It's got to be inside the class, but not inside any other methods. I still prefer to keep main up at the top, but it doesn't really matter if it goes before or after this other method. I'll just put it here. It's going to start with public static void again until we learn some of the variations on that. And next, I'll call this output title. Remember to put parentheses at the end, even though they're empty, and create a code block to hold the code for this method. This will be a simple write line statement. And I'm going to call this method right away so I don't forget it up here in main. And let's run this one more time to make sure everything works the way we expect. And that looks good. Just one last thing to point out here. One method can call another. And I think that's probably kind of obvious, but when we're first learning to code, sometimes we overthink things. I can go to my output chorus method, and I can replace a couple of these output statements with calls to output title. Let me run this again and see what that does. Hopefully that's what you expect, right? When the output chorus method runs, it's going to go line by line. It's calling the write line method a couple of times, and since I've defined a method called output title, it can call that in the same way. From this point forward, most of the programs you write are going to use methods. We've seen how to define and call a method, and from here we can go forward and learn how to make these methods a little more flexible and useful.